Hello everyone, this is our final lecture for AP Human Geography, Unit number 7, Cities and Urban Land Use. Tonight we're going to be talking about low-income areas around the world. So here we go. To start us out, just comparing low-income areas between MDCs and LDCs, looking at some of the characteristics that we see in these areas. Now in LDCs, really just the defining characteristic is that the lowest income areas we're going to classify as squatter settlements. Now, again, we have talked about this a little bit in class and talking about our urban models. These are the lowest income areas. These are the areas of the most extreme poverty. So when we talked about the Millennium Development Goals, these are the areas where we're going to see a lot of people living on less than $1.25 a day. That's in less developed countries. In more developed countries, we see that these are going to be our inner city areas. And typically, going back to our last lecture, the inner city areas, one of the issues that we see most prevalent in these areas is as jobs are reduced, as we see unemployment go up, a lot of times due to things like deindustrialization. Because there's high unemployment, we see a lot of people who aren't paying into the tax system because those taxes aren't being taken out of their paychecks because they're not earning a paycheck. And so that tax base is reduced, which then means that the city has a harder time paying for the services in these areas. So a lot of times we will see services like schools closing down. So that's kind of hitting that illiteracy point there. We see we can't employ as many police officers. So we see issues like crime more prevalent in these low income areas. So a lot of the different elements that we have discussed end up becoming connected in these different areas. So going back, this is going to be a little bit of review from our migration unit, and as well as ethnicity and other elements of culture that we talked about. Going back, we talked about as suburbanization is taking place, as we start to see more affluent families leave the inner city and move out to the suburbs, that tax base once again diminishes. Now, that is another contributing factor. We talked about unemployment as diminishing the tax base, but also there's the element of out-migration, particularly to the suburbs. And so that tax base diminishes, those services diminish. But again, those high income or more affluent families, we mentioned in both migration and ethnicity as white flight. That is that term that is often associated with it. So kind of make a mention of that with regards to this. So as this is happening, we see services diminish. Cities, especially inner cities, end up becoming the centers of poverty. And this is when we can incorporate one of our vocabulary terms called brownfields, which is a former industrial or commercial site that is underused, vacant, or abandoned. And this largely happens as people start to leave and services are diminished. And is the potential for environmental contamination. A lot of times this is especially associated with industrial areas. So let's take a look at an example. This is an industrial area in western Pennsylvania. So a couple of questions that I have for you guys are, what city in western Pennsylvania do you think that this photo was taken from? And based on that point, what industry do you think that this is connected to? Because again, brownfields often are these industrial areas that are left vacant, perhaps as a product of deindustrialization, because that's an important point. Remember that this entire area, when we talk about western Pennsylvania, kind of southwest New York, into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, certainly Michigan, we called it the Rust Belt. So remember the type of industries that we talked about in this particular area. So a couple of questions for you to respond to. Western Pennsylvania, what city do you think this is, as well as what industry do you think you're associating this with? So, as those affluent families begin to leave, their homes are vacated. Now, this is when we can introduce the concept of filtering. Now, I know a lot of students have had a tough time with understanding the difference between filtering and gentrification. Now, gentrification we will discuss later. But here's the definition of filtering, and then we'll elaborate on it. The process in which more prosperous families move out of older housing and into newer housing, creating a vacancy, which is filled by families that are less wealthy. Now, essentially, what typically is associated with filtering is when you take a home, let's say a single family detached home, and subdivide it into two separate residences. So you take a building that used to house one family, and now you turn it into basically a duplex, housing two families. Now, essentially, what ends up happening is over time, uh, the landlord, whoever owns this property now, begins to not fix things up, and different elements of the house begin to move into a state of disrepair. They haven't been taken care of. So these less wealthy families move out to look for a better residence, and someone else moves in, even lower income. And once again, they drop the price, they drop the rent, and eventually what happens is that these houses are just left abandoned because it is not financially viable for the landlord to pay to fix up the house. And so they just let it sit vacant. And so the city, when this happens on a large scale, begins to fall apart. And this is when we can introduce this concept of redlining, which was a historical practice. It is no longer allowed to happen. So here's our definition: a discriminatory real estate practice in North America in which members of minority groups are prevented from obtaining money to purchase homes or property in predominantly white neighborhoods. Today, this practice is officially illegal. Um, the Community Reinvestment Act here in the United States actually required banks to keep track of census tracts, so at the census tract level, where their investments were going. Now, a lot of times redlining happened in conjunction with blockbusting. So we can actually make a connection here, is that blockbusting, when real estate agents would go in and try to scare white families out of leaving their homes, moving to a different area, largely out to the suburbs, which then facilitated white flight that we mentioned before. Then these real estate agents would come in, or someone would come in, buy up the property, filter it down, so then lower income families are coming in. But then these areas wouldn't be able to be rebuilt. So banks didn't loan any money to fix some of the issues that needed to be addressed. In addition to that, minority families that came in and wanted to buy property there couldn't because the banks refused to lend to them. And so let's take a look at how this manifested itself. So this is a map of Charlotte, North Carolina. And redlining and a lot of the practices that we've been talking about were very much in place in the American South. And so you can see from the image, and I know on your note packet you don't have the colors there, but the colors are very important because the term redlining, the reason it got its name, and you can see it in this image here, is that they would quite literally draw a red line around a part of the city and say, we're not gonna loan any money to these areas. We're not gonna sell to people in this area, which was incredibly discriminatory. But what ended up happening is the cities just fell apart as a result of this. And so it's important to note, and you can see some of the areas, and I know again in your note packet you don't have the colored graphics on here, but please do make a note that the term redlining literally came about because they would draw a red line around these areas. And so in looking at this on the lecture, you can see the areas where they refuse to lend. And so please do make that note. So one thing that we ended up beginning to see in these inner city low income areas was public housing. So by definition, it is housing that is owned by the government. In the United States, it is rented to residents with low incomes, and the rents are set at 30% of the family's incomes. Now, depending on the resource that you use, that number, you may see that number vary a little bit. It may be something like, a minimum of 28.5% or something like that. But typically, it's going to be around 30% of the family's income. All right. So it is going to fluctuate a little bit. Now, a term that is often associated with public housing is Section 8 housing. And when someone were to say Section 8 housing, it refers to Section 8 of the Housing Act of 1937. And what Section 8 housing is actually, it's a more common name for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is funded by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it allows for low-income residents to qualify for rent assistance, is really what we're talking about. And there are other elements where someone might be able to purchase a home and get assistance in paying for that home, especially if they are low income. And typically, disproportionately, we see it clustered in inner city areas. But in the United States, it only represents about 1% of housing. So for 1% of the population. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it's going to be about 14% of the population. But in the UK, they extend it beyond just low income. So there's a variety of different groups that are able to use public housing in the United Kingdom. So it could be obviously low income. There are programs for single mothers. There are programs for those who are disabled or handicapped. So it extends beyond just low income. Anyone who might need assistance is essentially how it's applied in the United Kingdom. But we don't see nearly as much money devoted to it here in the United States from the federal government. For example, just to give you some numbers, because again, we don't like to make statements without backing them up with some evidence. Between 1980 and 2000, the number of public housing units decreased by about 1 million. But the number of people who would have qualified for public housing went up by about 2 million people during the same time period, 1980 to 2000. Now, once again, anytime we start talking about some of these more controversial topics, there are different things that people may use to explain or try to explain the different sides of this. So that's important, that these are very, very complex topics and can be very, very controversial when you start talking about them. For example, let's go ahead and introduce a case study of public housing, perhaps one of the largest case studies of public housing here in the United States. And that is the Robert Taylor homes on the south side of Chicago. Now, prior to the building of the Robert Taylor homes in 1962, that's when it was completed, we have to talk about the historical background in Chicago. And so I want to draw your attention back to remember our models of North American land use were largely built on the city of Chicago. And recall, when we looked at the concentric zone model and how it applied to Chicago, we saw that area that was labeled the Black Belt. And the Black Belt, prior to this time period, up to about 1960, was about 75% of Chicago's African American population living in that Black Belt. And it was on the south side of Chicago. It was the poorest part of the city. And to give some other elements in terms of development, the infant mortality rate in the Black Belt was about 16% where else in Chicago. So this was an area that was, in developmental terms, very underdeveloped. And there are a lot of other statistics that we could look at. So in this particular area, it was decided to build this public housing project. And I mean, was the largest project in the world. 28 16-story buildings, and numbers are going to vary because I've actually seen terms saying it was 15 stories, um, nearly 30,000 people. Some say it was about 27,000. Um, but one account that I read was that this was designed for 11,000 people, but nearly 30,000 were living there. Certainly more than double, and perhaps approaching triple what was intended to be there, what it was designed for. So, incredibly high population density, incredibly high concentration of people. Now, for a variety of factors, as you can see, they're listed: poor planning, lack of opportunity, crime. Um, but let's give some more specifics. Let's give some details. Um, in the area immediately surrounding the Robert Taylor homes, there was very much a lack of services. We could actually say that this area was labeled as a food desert. I mean, there were a lack of, available fresh food, grocery stores, things like that. The Chicago Housing Authority actually said, with regards to crime in and around the Robert Taylor homes, the Chicago Housing Authority said that on a daily basis, daily, $45,000 worth of drug deals took place on a daily basis. To give some context to the amount of crime that was going on there. And if you're wondering, like, how could it be that high, that staggeringly high? Well, some numbers reported that unemployment in the Robert Taylor homes was as high as 95%. So when you talk about all of these factors taken into consideration, it perhaps shouldn't be a surprise that the Robert Taylor housing project was not a success, was a failure. And since then, all 28 buildings have been demolished and the area is slated to be redeveloped. So, this is just one case study of some of the issues that have plagued inner city areas. Now, we talked about how a city can deteriorate, but what about improvement? And that's when we introduce gentrification. Now, gentrification is the movement into the inner portions of American cities of middle and upper income people who replace low income populations, rehabilitate the structures they occupied, and change the social character of the neighborhoods. Now, this can be, as with just about everything else in this lecture, quite controversial. Now, there's a couple facts that we should point out. First off is we're talking about middle and upper income people moving into areas that were typically low income. And there were certain groups that were more likely to move in there. And those are the groups that you see down there at the bottom: yuppies. Yuppies is a term for young urban professionals. Sinks, dinks, those are single income, dual income, respectively, with no kids. And then empty nesters. Now, yuppies, sinks, and dinks tend to be younger groups of people, whereas empty nesters tend to be older. The kids have left the nest, so to speak. And all of these groups have something in common, that they have extra money. They're not paying for children yet. And so they have extra money, disposable money, and a lot of times are very much connected to a downtown area for a variety of different reasons. They work down there. Social life attracts them down there. So there's a lot of different reasons why. Also, when we take a look at why middle income families would want to move here, and when we say families, we should actually clarify middle income groups, would want to move to lower income areas. Well, there's larger residences, the buildings might be designed in a particular way. A lot of times they are cheaper. Land values have been depressed for a period of time. And so these are factors that would influence this. Now, again, this can be a very controversial topic. So let's look at the facts. In this case, let's start out with saying that we gentrification is characterized by middle and higher income people moving into an inner city area. They improve the area and property values go up. Now, that by itself isn't necessarily controversial because that's what happens. What then becomes controversial is the question that follows. Is this done to the benefit or the detriment of people who were already there? That's the question. Now, obviously, if property values are going up, it would seem that this is going to be to the benefit of people that are living there. But also, as with any controversial issue, let's look at both sides. Yes, property values are going up. But on the other side, if property values are going up, so too are rents. So can the people who are already living there afford those rents as they are going up? And that's when this becomes controversial. Now, it's not my place as a teacher to say this is right, this is wrong. Instead, what my goal is to present both sides and allow you, the individual, to make the decision based on what you feel is important. And so, again, this can be a very controversial topic. So let's bring this back to the local. One area where we've seen property values increase and we've seen middle and higher income groups start to move back in is down around Fremont Street. And this is part of what is known as the Downtown Project. Now, a little bit of background. The Downtown Project is headed up by Tony Hsieh of Zappos. He's the CEO of Zappos. And in this area, he relocated the headquarters for Zappos to downtown Las Vegas. And it was a huge win for Las Vegas because of what Tony Hsieh has brought to the downtown area. And so tons of money, tons of development has come back down to the downtown area, particularly areas like East Fremont. That's the image that you see here with Container Park. Very modern, attracts a lot of young individuals to this downtown area. You've probably seen areas off of Fremont Street that you've seen new businesses open up, new stores. It's more walkable. This is all something that is part of the Downtown Project. Now, to bring this back to this somewhat controversial topic, is this gentrification? And once again, to the even more controversial topic, is this a positive or negative thing? Because that's the big concept here. And there, once again, as your teacher, it's not my place to say right or wrong, but to look at the elements here in our local community and allow you the ability as an individual to make that decision on your own. So think about this downtown project, and if you've been down to Fremont Street recently, it's changing. It's changing quite a bit. So that gives us the opportunity to talk positive, negative. What do you think? Finally, all of this thus far has been talking about MDCs, and towards the end, we do have to mention very low income areas in LDCs, and these areas are labeled as squatter settlements. Now, the United Nations, one estimate, has the number of people living in squatter settlements at 175 million. Another estimate by the United Nations has it at 880 million. Because these are the areas where people are living in the most extreme forms of poverty. If we go back to the Millennium Development Goals, that the Millennium Development Goal number 1 that focuses on reducing the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day, that's focused on squatter settlements and the extreme rural areas. Goal number 7 that talks about improving the quality of life for 100 million slum dwellers, that's focused on squatter settlements. So these areas go by a variety of different names depending on where in the world um, you're seeing them, whether they go by slums is probably another way that you're most likely to see them. But again, there's a lot of different regional terms: barrios, favelas, shanty towns, some of the most common that you may see. These areas are almost exclusively on the outskirts of the city, the periphery of the city, and people are going to build this with whatever they can find. A lot of times there's limited, if any, services because by definition, these squatter settlements are areas that are taken up illegally. People don't own or rent this land. They just move here. And that's product of rural to urban migration, product of very large, very high natural increase rates. So there's a lot of different contributing factors here. But more than talking about this, I think it is more powerful and more compelling to show you some of these images. So this is a squatter settlement in India. Clearly, this was not designed as a settlement, and this is an example of people building with whatever they can find, whatever is available to them. Once again, another example in India. One of the most common building materials that you're going to see in squatter settlements is corrugated tin, because it's fairly durable. And so a lot of times you'll see it as roofs or siding on these buildings. And you can see this area was not intended for development. These houses are almost quite literally falling into the water here. So once again, another image, in this case, the Philippines. And we cannot reiterate enough that people are using whatever they can find. And what might be labeled as trash by some, for others, especially those living in squatter settlements, it's something to provide protection. And that's something that might be difficult to wrap your head around. In South Africa, shanty towns. And this is going to be in South Africa. We're actually going to talk about a example. There's actually a resort in South Africa that is modeled after a shanty town, after a squatter settlement, where people who are quite wealthy can come and live as if they are in a shanty town. And we'll have a conversation about what kind of message that sends. In Brazil, they're known as favelas. In some of the coastal areas that are fairly hilly or mountainous, these squatter settlements are built all the way up these hills, almost quite literally on top of one another. And it's not uncommon, especially in the rainy season, to see landslides where just huge sections of these favelas are taken out. And our final image for tonight looks at, again, a favela in Brazil. But what really hopefully catches your attention here is the juxtaposition of the incredibly wealthy on one side and the incredibly poor on the other. Now, this is actually something that we could make a connection to back in political geography. In our Walled World Web Quest, we talked about communities in Brazil that separated the incredibly wealthy from the incredibly poor by walls. And when you look at this and try to imagine the day-to-day life that plays out on either side of this wall, just that thought alone, I think, is pretty powerful, to try and put yourself in the shoes of someone on either side of this wall and realizing that just a few feet away, life plays out in a completely different way is something powerful to consider. Now, I know this is pretty heavy material to leave you with, but this is our final slide for this evening. This is our final slide for this lecture. This is our final slide for this unit and our final slide for the year. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you in class tomorrow.